Yeah, thank you, Ansgar. It's really a pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts with you, and thank you for the invitation. I think we are going back to basics in a certain sense, and I want to invite you to reflect a bit on the topic of tacit knowledge and how it relates to culture and how it relates also to narrative. And I'm just trying to make this work, yeah. As Lisa Sunshine has reminded us in one of her books, the relation between culture and brain, culture and the mind has been there since we are doing cultural studies or cultural studies. And no smaller person than Raymond Williams has made it very clear that we have to attend the brain as much as the culture when we want to speak about our contemporary culture. And he has also mentioned in The Long Revolution this, what is in the end the secret of tacit knowledge, which is the learning of models, the learning of ways of seeing, and the learning of ways of world making, of course, which make up a certain culture, a whole way of living, as Raymond Williams said, which allows us to simultaneously see what is universal in cultures, even this, that they are particular ways of seeing, but we also see that each of the cultures offer their specific way of seeing. And I wanted to take you to some of these observations, and starting with a closer look at the brain, and with an argument which I think is fundamentally important, which has to do with what actually our learning does to our brain. And it does something like Bruce Wexler has described here. It introduces ways of perceiving reality, which then start to be also ways of limiting our capacity of perceiving, in the sense that we follow the once established patterns of perception from a certain point of, from a certain moment onwards. So this inscription of our ways of seeing, I think, is something that we have to take into account, and that I would like, in a very general sense, term as tacit knowledge, and I will develop on that further. And if we want to look at one or two very concrete examples, you all know this perception fallacy, right? So that it seems that B is longer than A, but it is of course not. They are both the same. The interesting thing about this is that we fall into this fallacy, but not every culture falls into it. So there are people in the world, peoples to say, who actually do not fall into this fallacy. They immediately say, of course, A is as long as B, and they have no doubt on that. And if you see this data over there, Western cultures, grossly speaking, are on the fallacy side of things, and cultures which are living in a natural environment like forests, they do not fall into this. For the very simple reasons that their viewing is not shaped by rectangular and symmetric constellations, but by natural forms which do not have things like things like angels and so on. Angles, how do you say angles? Angels are something else. Anyhow. So you see, even this kind of, where we think that it is normal to be drawn into this fallacy, is not normal. It is normal for us, as we are trained to see the world in a certain sense, and for others who are trained in a different way, it is not. A second very nice example are the famous London taxi drivers. Many of you might know this, that over time their gray matter changes, the posterior gray matter grows and the anterior gray matter decreases. Whatever that means, it just means that how longer you are a taxi driver in London, the stronger is this change of your brain. And if you compare this to bus drivers in London, then you see a huge difference. Because the job of a bus driver is very easy, because he just follows always the same line, whereas a taxi driver has to know all the roads and streets in London to escape from the traffic. So the practical use of the brain, the practical use of a tool of orientation leads to changes in the brain that in the end a good taxi driver is a good taxi driver and a good bus driver is not. And that makes these shaping of the brain limiting your capacity of perceiving or not perceiving things. And if you now imagine what happens to Uber drivers who just rely on their app to go to certain places, then you see how we do an outsourcing of this capacity, and no longer nothing of this happens with our brain. Anyhow, I'm just mentioning this to draw your attention to something very simple, but that people in neuroscience tend to forget, and people in culture science or culture studies sometimes do not acknowledge sufficiently. That is the central role of culture in the working of the brain. And the picture that I'm showing is one of our summer schools in Lisbon, and the colleague who's talking over there is a neuroscientist who has worked a lot with us, and he presents this graphic to show what factors impact on the brain in different ways. And there somewhere, I just should go a bit further, there you see that culture is one of the context influences of the brain. You also see that behavior, think of the London taxi driver, also impacts on the brain. When we are speaking about tacit knowledge, then we are speaking of both of these realms or these areas. So we are speaking about culture and education, but at the same time we are speaking of behavior as well. And in a general line, and to make a strong thesis right from the scratch, I used to say that the brain is really empty without culture. And all tentatives to think the brain as an organ on its own do not work, because the brain only works when it is actually submitted and shaped and oriented by culture. And that is, as you all know, the underlying idea behind the viii cognition, which has been sufficiently mentioned already here, but which is a great revolution for the study of the brain. And I think we should take all opportunities to make our role as culture studies people strong in this field as being a necessary contribution to the understanding of the brain and of the mind as a consequence of what is happening to the brain. And if you are speaking of embodiment, let me just address two other things. The proximity of action and linguistic representation in the brain. So this is very close. Lag words are very close to lag movements. And food words are very close to food movements, if these representations of what is happening in the brain say anything. But let's suppose that they actually do. So between action words and actions, there is a very close relation, and that is also kind of embodiment, of course, of all what we are dealing with when we are speaking about language or literature. And one of the big challenges is also how we understand then the evolution of mindful speaking, in the sense of course, when we are speaking about movement, then it is easy to see, but what about abstract things, and what about abstract realities that we are addressing? And in this sense, I believe to a certain point that the simulation hypothesis could help us, in spite of other opinions or other doubts on that, could help us to get a step closer. And if we observe language performance around abstract concepts, then we might find this confirmed. They derive from smaller concepts, or from concept of movement and bodily inscription, which are more direct. So even if we are speaking about abstract things, there might be an embodiment which goes down to brain reality. So one of the abstract things, and it has also been mentioned in several talks already, is when we speak about cultural models. So cultural models would be the way that we learn to see the world, and that would then shape our brain, and then would shape our perception of the world again, and in a continuous enrollment, entanglement of perceiving, conceiving, understanding, questioning, and so on and so forth. Cultural models, there are many forms of describing or naming them. I used to follow Brad Shaw, a British anthropologist, who has distinguished three forms. I've mentioned linguistic models so far. Of course, there are non-linguistic models, and all of them are very interesting to see in their activity and the limitation and the possibilities they offer to the mind. For me, the most challenging one are these, which Brad Shaw calls a functional distinction among models, where we speak of all these things which help us to get around, to have a notion of the space, to have a notion of the time, but also have to a notion of what are entities which we can claim for explanation, so science, theories, stories, narratives, or even divinatory entities. It is something that we carry with us as the instrument to be in our world. And these cultural models, once again, vary from culture to culture. They do also vary from person to a certain point, but this is what happens to cultural issues in many ways. But they mainly are a general feature of any culture. So any culture would work on cultural models. So you can be against a certain model, but you cannot be against models in general. And which is not nothing, which is already something, I think. And in this sense, some years ago, in Bergamo, I once suggested to speak about intramental translation. As you see, it would work somehow like conceptual blending. And we would have a certain perception which is then confronted with a cultural model which make a percept fitting into a concept which then makes its meaning. Of course, nothing of this happens really, right? But it is a model, or let's say a schema, to represent something which is ongoing when we perceive the world and when we understand the world or try to understand the world. And this would be, the form of a translation occurring in the brain, and once again, I do not believe that it really happens like that. I just show it as a way of understanding what is going on when concepts and percepts meet and then build a meaning in the sense of what Leonard Tolmie called ception, conception, perception, ception. And then you get a second intramental translation when you speak about it, which is a second effort, which makes it still a bit more complicated. Here's a very nice cartoon reflecting on this. You see Charlie Brown looking at the clouds, and then they all start interpreting what the clouds mean and what they represent, and in the end, oh, that's very good. What do you see in the clouds, Charlie Brown? And then Charlie Brown says, oh, well, see, I was going to see a ducky and a horse, but I changed mind. And that is actually the process of intermental translation, matching the concept, the perception matching the conception. You all know this, and this switching of perception through the intervention of conception. So if you know this exercise, if you want to just see the duck and you fix the duck, nevertheless, if you are healthy and not very sleepy, the rabbit appears again, even against your strong will to just see the duck. So I think this is a good way of understanding how conception and perception come together. And again, this is not a small thing. We have here two armies fighting against each other for making the others believe that it is a duck or a rabbit. This is a very strong, not controllable and not conscious way of seeing the world. Now, maybe another example of conceptual blending and how our cultural models impact on our way of seeing the world. You have already imagined the flying pigs, all of you, right? Now I'm just asking you, did you see something like that? No? Maybe you saw something like that? So these are the two that I can offer you. The one is called Pegasus. If you are more, and I'm taking this from Benjamin Bergen. So Pegasus, if you are more a classical trained scholar, or super swine if not. But this shows how much our cultural experience impacts on what we actually imagined. You know, it's now a matter of creativity, and creativity is, in this sense, also a matter of cultural models, which might blend together in different ways. Some weeks ago, I happened to show these slides to another group, and then someone talked about Pink Floyd, and I had totally forgotten. But there is a flying flying pig as well, right? Right? It doesn't, but it flies. It's a fly. It doesn't have wings. It's flying. It's flying. It's not the wing thing that we were seeing before, but it's flying anyhow. And if you see the chain of culture, so the person who mentioned Pink Floyd reminded me of something that I had forgotten, but which is certainly in my mind on flying pigs. We all know that behind this, there is another cultural layer, which is the animal farm. So you see this summing up of cultural models, references, which might make up our imagination when we are speaking about flying pigs. And once again, it is not a matter of control or of being us to say, I will now call this or that. It is a matter of what is, to a certain point, available tacitly for you when you're dealing with that. And that, as you all know, has a lot of consequences in terms of how you see the world and how you relate things in the world. So the question, which of the three go together? There are two answers, of course. The two animals, because they are animals. So it's a systematic view of the world, or the monkey and the banana as a relational view of the world. So if you are trained in relational worldviews, then you would tend to one, and if not, you would turn to the other. And as some people try to make clear, this divides the world into two ways of seeing it, the Western and the Eastern. I don't believe in anything like that. But this is, of course, true that different shaping of our tacit knowledge in terms of what we privilege as a matter of organization then leads to different cultural forms which express itself again in different ways. And then you have this the cognitive preferences translating into behavior, and behavior then working on the cognitive preference again. So many of this is a matter of education, being exposed, being trained, and that is the key thing on tacit knowledge and cultural models. Another example taken from Gerd Gigerenz's book on gut feelings, you see the different holes on the left and out-popping bubbles on the right? And if I do this now, then it is just the other way around and nothing changed. And behind it there is something that we tacitly assume, in spite of different experiences, that the shadows have to do with light, and we think that light comes from above. It's a century-old thing that the sun is somewhere up there, though we know that now light is coming from everywhere. But that has not yet changed our tacit assumption that light comes from above, and that therefore we see bubbles in one case and popping up on the other hand. So I think this is important as seeing how much this tacit knowledge is with us. We have learned it, in this case, maybe evolutionarily, by evolution. In many other cases, certainly by culture and by the environment that we are exposed to. And we have been talking about identity several times already. We have seen a similar image in the morning as well. But I think that one of the interesting approaches to understand identity is this strange loop, which was suggested by Douglas Hofstadter, which is that what I was trying to describe between patterns and models and behavior, which mutually shape and enhance each other's on a continuous way, that in the end, I is what I have been taught to be, learned to be, done, and taught myself to others. So a strange, continuous loop. And that is just a tentative to mention something else. I think an understanding of this strange loop in the sense of quantum mind or quantum physics might be a way of, in the future, understanding subjectivity as this walking wave function that Alexander Wendt is suggesting to our human existence. Not something which is separate as an identity towards the world, but in a continuous entanglement where the consciousness and the world and the object, the former and the later, are actually mutually impacting. So one thing that has been also already very relevant in Karen Kukonen's work on literature, which is our mind working always on assumptions or the tentative of prediction, relying on the cultural models, on the expectations, on previous experiences, and trying to match again what is actually at stake. So another aspect that I should mention here, of course, which is one of the most important instruments that we culturally have acquired to make this work and sustainably work, which is reading. The hypothesis that we have, or the possibility that we have to externally storage our knowledge for future training or for future reference. We, as university people, would not be anything without libraries. Of course, libraries would not be anything without our capacity of reading. This is, of course, the cultural contribution to a certain way of dealing with the world. And my colleagues that I showed before has worked on the effects of learning writing and reading in an older age, because in Portugal we had a lot of people who did not know how to read and write. And he did this studies, and as he proved widely, there is a huge impact on the general functioning of the brain through the acquisition of reading capacities. So this is a technology of culture that we all assume as, but which makes a whole difference. Imagine people who do not want to read, or who are not inclined to read, who prefer to watch TV series or something like that. Is there someone out there? You don't know. But you see my point. It is a technology which needs attention, which needs our cultivation, and therefore it should be present as one of the elements of tacit knowledge that we are caring of. This all with a brain which is generally speaking the same, but due to cultural efforts, very different from what it has been in former times, and it is increasingly depending on networks and external extension of its capacities. All this, of course, might also invite us to critically think about the consequences on education, the consequences on our understanding of the mind, the consequences on our understanding of academia, and also of the social and culturally constituted world in the general sense. Though this is a book, I think, already from the late 90s, I'm not sure, Critical Neuroscience, it is still one of those books which are really worth reading, because it is so interesting and challenging what neuroscience tells us, but we also have to be aware what that means for us as human beings who do not want to be overcome by artificial intelligence, for instance, or other results from neuroscientific practices. Now, a bit closer already to the end of my talk, I'm always very fast. This is a story that you also might know, so please, those who know, please don't say anything. Linda is a 31-year-old single, outspoken and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice and participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which of the following two alternatives is more probable? Linda is a bank teller. Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. What do you see? Who is voting for Linda is a bank teller? And who is voting for Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement? The majority. Thankfully, you're nice. Of course, those who voted for the first are right, because it is much more probable, logically speaking, that she is one thing than one thing and the other, right? But nevertheless, we all tend to vote for the second one. And I think this is really interesting, because it shows the power of narratives. And that's where I wanted to get. Something that we seem to be equipped with, or we have along of our cultural history, equipped ourselves. We believe that stories make sense. So if you read a story, 4 lines only, but still an effort, then you think this has to mean something. It cannot just be that reality is what it is. A story means something. And more than that, so that's the first thing about narrative, right? We understand that narrative makes sense, or we want narrative to make sense. That's better to say. And the second thing is, we also want that life makes sense. So we also want, and we had several talks on this already, that what is true in a story is also true in life, or that what happens in life makes sense towards the life itself. So these are very strong, let's say, convictions that we carry around when we deal with stories or narratives. So before addressing any concrete cultural model in terms of narrative, the first tacit knowledge that we face when we're dealing with stories is that we believe that they make sense. And this is, again, not nothing. You all know Bruner's narrative construction of reality, and this list of 10 points which narratives need to have to be narratives, and which are really, really great. And I wanted to say, in terms of tacit knowledge, 2 things about that. The first is that it seems that stories, narratives, generally speaking, are made of these 10 features. which is already a very interesting finding. So independently of which normativeness is addressed, there is a normativeness addressed in a story. And so equipped with a set of stories, we are equipped with a set of normative references. Or we see in stories those normative references which we are equipped with. And storytelling in this sense activates these kinds of training to a certain point. So there's some general cultural feature which is then specifically translated into each culture, which is the composition of narrative as such. And that is what the Brunner big finding thing. And the second thing that I wanted to say that has also been present in the last 2 days is the last point, the 10th point, narrative accrual. So narrative come together into clusters of genre, clusters of certain traditions, clusters of certain topics, and they make the cultural point. So they accumulate in something like a culture. So those that Deborah presented have been subject to a certain military culture on the one hand, but of course a certain self-culture on the other hand, and of course a certain economic culture in terms of publishing houses on the third hand, and that makes, so in the end, they all work in the same direction of one reinforcing cultural project, right? And I think that is an additional force of narrative, not only the fact that they are all composed in the same way. If I have 3 minutes, okay. I wanted to show you this with a small text written by a German author, which I found the English translation here. But maybe I will not have time to go into details, but as you see by the bold words and by the bullet points that I've presented here, so it is about historical references, contemporary experience, action scripts, abstract concepts which come together in one narrative. And these are 4 forms of frequent tacit knowledge which are not, let's say, immediately visible. And they are all related to our viii cognition. So the episodic knowledge in terms of historical references, the semantic knowledge in terms of abstract concepts, and so on. The procedural knowledge, I very much like this procedural knowledge concerning death. You know, we don't really know, but we are supposed to. And the perceptual knowledge of embodiment. And if we all bring this all together, I think then we have a notion of the wide range of tacit knowledge that is impacting on our mind and also on our cultural model, which derives from our cultural models, then translating into narrative. So you see the list of elements that I mentioned during my talk, and which actually make up the conception of tacit knowledge. And maybe we can add to the viii cognition definition these points that I mentioned. Embodied is a kind of strange loop. The enacted has to do with stories and action scripts. Extended has to do from telling to writing, and then I very much like this theological term of the Sitz im Leben. This is a place in life that cognition has as much as any story has, and which is always a key to its understanding. And in this sense, that would be my suggestion concerning distant knowledge, and we can know more than we can tell. I have not mentioned Michael Polanyi, who is, of course, the one who gave the name to the whole thing. Thank you.